Welcome to the Emerald City Sportscast, hosted by longtime Northwest sports journalist Dan Viennes. News, analysis, and opinions from Dan and his guests on the Mariners, Seahawks, Kraken, and more. And now, here's your host, Dan Viennes.
Well, the intro is a little outdated, but so what? We're going to have a lot of fun today, you guys. Had to brush the dust off the old podcast. Been busy these days with the Field Goals podcast, focusing on the Seahawks, but how can I not talk about the Seattle Mariners? Not only breaking the 21-year playoff drought, but doing it in style, sweeping the Blue Jays in the Wild Card Series. A historical comeback in Game 2 to finish that series off. And as we get set to open the division series, best of 5 against Houston tomorrow, I thought we would look back. How did we get here? Where were we 4 years ago? And who better to talk about that than with my old friend, Jason Churchill, founder of ProspectInsider.com, host of Baseball Things, the best baseball podcast out there. Jason, it's been a minute since we've talked. I want to start with this. When Baseball Things was born, we were in the depths of that drought. So how is it now? How much fun is it to do some podcast episodes and talk about a playoff Mariner team?
It doesn't even feel real. Yeah, it really doesn't. You know, just about every show I've done at Baseball Things, when I'm doing other people's shows, I keep getting to the point in the conversation where I'm like, are we sure we're actually doing this? Or are we going to wake up? It really doesn't even feel real at this point. We could kind of see it coming. I think ever since maybe, mid-August or so, I think most of us were convinced this was not just a possibility, but it would be a surprise if they didn't get to the postseason at least. But once they did, it was just, it was difficult to operate as if it were legit and real. I kept expecting to kind of roll over and wake up and go, well, there's 7 games out with 4 games to go. And then this isn't real. It was a dream. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the battered fan syndrome really does kick in. You can't help it. There was a moment there, I don't know, 25-ish games from the end of the season where guys are dropping like flies. They had injury issues. Suarez gets hurt. Julio's got the back problem. Some guys were struggling. That offense was struggling again to put runs on the board. And Baltimore was playing well. And you started to get a little nervous. You started to feel kind of that, here we go again. We can't have nice things. The Mariners just aren't, we just don't ever get to do this. And then the last couple of weeks, it just seemed like a foregone conclusion. The teams behind us just weren't playing well. And guys started to come back. And it just seemed like the kind of the schedule, the way it played out too. And Mariners had an easy run there at the end, and the way the pitching was going, that it was going to happen. And which is what made it so cool about the way they clinched, because it felt like it was going to be, after 21 years, if you can believe this, it felt like it was going to be anticlimactic. But then they made it, anything but. I mean, that's really the moment right there.
Yeah, I was actually worried about it. On occasion, at least a couple of times a month, I have Joe Doyle co-host Baseball Things with me. And Joe, I'm going to share this for like the 5th time because it is such a great analogy. And I'm actually going to pull up what he said here. You will appreciate this. So we were talking about that. We were talking about how, you get to a certain point in the season, and for the Mariners, 20 years, the drought, all that good stuff, and you're gonna back into it. You're gonna start a game at 7:00, and then the 3rd inning of that game, you're going to learn that you're in, and you're right. The crowd's not going to go crazy. The players are not going to celebrate on the field. And the way Joe put it, is it would be like a guilty, sulking champagne bath. And then he texts, can you imagine? You're a 30-year-old virgin putting immense pressure on yourself to get it out of the way, Dan. You find the girl of your dreams. You get to the finish line. She dumps you. And then your buddy buys you a sex worker to, quote unquote, help out. That's what it would feel like if you're the Mariners and you back out. That was the perfect analogy. So it was amazing that they were able to, at the very least, kind of do it themselves and win it and clinch it themselves. For the fans, for the players, like, you want the payoff to be there, and because of the way they won it, it really was. So you're right. Yeah, it really looked like they were going to back in, and it's really great that they didn't. You know what? At the end of the day, I don't want to say that's as important as getting in, but it almost is in a lot of ways. You need those celebrations to really kind of exercise those demons.
I think it was huge, and it can't be understated. It when you're a young team and you're experiencing this for the first time, and you're coming together as a clubhouse and learning what it is to be a winning team and to win in those moments. I was pulling for the Orioles to win that whole day. I didn't want them, to exactly as you described it. I didn't want them to get that, to learn in the second inning or whatever that they were in the playoffs. I wanted them to have that celebration on the field, to somehow win it on their own and get to experience that. Now, did we think it was going to happen the way it did? Of course not.
In a way, we kind of did, though, don't you think, Dan?
Not specifically.
Right, but you were like, it's going to be chaos and somebody's hitting a walk-off, right? Like, that's just kind of the way things have gone.
Let me tell you a quick story about how I experienced that, because it was unique, but it was also a little frustrating. So I'm at work Friday night, right? And I'm following it, and my boss is fantastic. He knows what a fan I am. He's pushed my start time back a few times these last couple of weeks so I can, watch the early game. He's great. I'm going to lean on him to do that again on Thursday for game 2. Thankfully, I don't have to work my regular job on Tuesday. So I'm watching, it's bottom of the 9th, and I've been tracking the game. And at the beginning of the game, I'm talking to one of my other coworkers who's into baseball, and I'm looking at the hitters that are coming up, and I see Terens is due up third, and I said, they'll probably pinch hit Cal for him, right? I'm having to watch. I don't have the MLB. I have the app. I have the basic subscription, but not the in-market game one. There's no way to watch it on my phone. So I'm watching it on the Gamecast part of it, right?
Okay.
The animated app where it shows you the pitches one by one.
Right.
Talk about an excruciating way to experience. Because you know how that works, right? It's like green if it's a strike, red if it's a ball, and blue if it's an out or a run. And so it's 3-2.
And there's the mistake right there in that product, right? Blue if it's an out or a run. Come on. Yeah.
So, and then there's a delay. And it took so long for that last pitch. In my mind, I'm thinking, did he just hit a home run? Because maybe it takes a little longer sometimes.
Right.
And I see the blue come in, and then it takes a second. It says run. And I don't know. Sometimes your brain just stops working, right? I'm thinking it's a run. There's nobody on base. There's a 3-2 count, 2 outs. He had to. Did Cal Raleigh just hit a goddamn walk-off home run to clinch this? Unbelievable. And then I couldn't wait to see the highlights and came home and watched. I recorded it all and watched all the celebration and everything. Just unbelievable. But I kind of think that moment, the way they did that, kind of took some of the pressure off. Like they've done that, right? And so with what happened Saturday might not have been able to happen if they hadn't won in that manner. I mean, it just. I don't know. I don't know that you can understate that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's interesting we haven't really heard any players talk about those kinds of things in particular, but they've hinted at since that clincher on that Friday that as the season is gone, and even going back to last season, some of the things that have happened have prepared them for everything that's happening, now. I mean, last year they come down to the wire, they're in it the last weekend. At least this year wasn't new. You get into the playoffs, and while you weren't in the playoffs last year, and most of these players have never been in the playoffs, you still, the playoffs are just quote unquote really important games, and eventually, do or die. So when you play do or die games down the stretch, you get some semblance of an experience of that playoff, kind of nature of games. And so I think you're right. I think all of that, including going back to last year, the final week of the season or so, these players are prepared for this. Like they understand how to put themselves in the right position, how to handle, nerves and things of that nature. By the way, I don't know if Cal Raleigh has any nerves. He's a dude like I'm serious, man. Like you watch that Toronto series, he was the best player in that series.
Yeah,
Cal Raleigh was the best player in the series, and I don't know that it was close, man. Like
I was disappointed that they don't give out a most outstanding player award in that series,
right?
In that wild card series, because hands down, there's no question it's him.
And it's remarkable. And you look at his season numbers, and I think I mentioned this on Twitter too. You look at Cal Raleigh's season numbers, and it's like, how did that guy only hit like 208 or whatever? That guy might hit 280 next year.
His at bats are phenomenal.
Yeah. And he's got 2 swings to deal with. This is really impressive what he's done. He's had a really great season. But yeah, like I don't know that nerves and inexperience in the playoffs is really much of a factor when other things have taken place to kind of prepare these guys for this situation. I think even going back to the minors and in college can do some things to prepare these guys for it. But clinching the way that they clinched and getting that Toronto series, winning it the way that they did, like there's nothing they can see from here on out that's really going to be surprising to the nerves, that's going to put them in a position where they're not comfortable, which is really great. I mean, it's not an older team, it's a younger team, but you do have some guys with experience, like Carlos Santana, Marco Gonzalez been in the playoffs, Adam Frazier, guys like that. And it's a pretty good mix. And I think those things, clinching the way that they did and winning game 2, I still can't get over game 2, Dad. And that was absolutely, I still don't really believe they were down 8-1 and came back to win. That's another thing. Like, is that real? Like,
I don't know.
Tell me, is that real?
And another classic case of like, I watched that game from like 4 different locations, right? Started at my house, went over to my girlfriend's place and watched the middle innings when it looked like it was, when it was 9-1 or 8-1, I headed back home and I actually in the middle of that game took a cat nap, like, but I couldn't escape it. Part of you goes, it's over. Right. I mean, they just need to get ready for game 3, not use up the bullpen, plan for tomorrow. But there's part of this team, more 1-run victories over the last 2 years, not just than any team in baseball, but I think the stat is more than any team in a 2-year period in 125 years.
Yeah.
More walk-off wins this year than any team in baseball. So, I'm lying there and I'm thinking, I better check on the game. I better check on this game. And, then they make it 8-5. And then I had to drive. And I literally, when JP hit the double to clear the bases, my life was in peril. I was on the floating bridge between cars, watching it on my phone. It was pretty crazy, but you talk about maybe the offense isn't as good as some of the other teams in the playoffs, but is any team out there more accustomed to playing playoff type games and managing playoff type games and tight games down the stretch when it comes to bullpen management and manipulating the lineup and things like that than the Mariners? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the ABCs of how the Mariners are built is at least as set for a playoff atmosphere as any team in baseball, including the Dodgers and the Astros. The talent isn't necessarily equal because it's really not, I think, let's be honest. But they are built to play close games, to win close games. They do hit the home run, almost 200 home runs this year, despite the fact that Julio didn't, he missed 25, 30 games. Yeah. Mitch was out almost, more than half the season. Ty France was kind of in and out of the lineup and not always 100%. Suarez even missed some time there at the end of the year, and they didn't pick up Santana until almost halfway through. This is a team that, if they were healthy, probably it's 220, 230 home runs this year. You can hit the ball at the ballpark, you can pitch, and you can defend, at least fundamentally, and not make a bunch of mistakes. You're going to have a chance to win playoff series, including the one that we're about to talk about, Astros Mariners. Like, that's a series Seattle can win. Are they going to be favored? Of course not. I don't expect them to win necessarily, but they're also not just going to roll over because they're going to hit the ball out of the ballpark and things are going to get really interesting in the series at some point.
All right. Before we talk about that series, I'm glad you mentioned how they were built because we're going to talk about that. November 2018, I came out to your office one night, late at night. I was jacked up on caffeine trying to get through the show. And it showed, by the way, when you go back and listen to the show, man, I was in 5th gear for sure. But we talked about, you invited me on the show because you wanted to talk about how I felt about the rebuild process in its infancy. It had just begun. November 2018, they had made the Zunino trade. They'd made the Diaz trade. They'd made the Paxton trade. Mm-hmm. And I've thought about this so many times throughout this season. I hearken back to that conversation, and it occurred to me that, man, a lot of the stuff we talked about kind of came to fruition very, very, it aligned very closely with how we talked about it had to if it was going to work. And I went back and pulled some sound. And I want to start with this. This is you talking about the timing of it, right? It's 2018. Just to recap, Jerry Dipoto had been there 3 years now. Tried to come in and win right away because they had a bunch of big contracts. Felix Cano, Nelson Cruz, Kyle Seager. Tried to win around that group. He was working for the old ownership group too. They weren't interested in a rebuild. So he tried to make the most of it. Patch things together around those guys. It didn't work. And then he convinced John Stanton, who had just taken over, and the ownership group that the only way they were going to compete, and he's talked much more openly about this now that they're winning again than he did back then. The only way they were going to compete was to tear it down and try to rebuild and reset. And this is what you had to say at that time, November 2018, about the timing of it all. And this was just a month into it.
Imagine if they'd waited. Imagine, and we'll stop right there, but imagine if they would have waited and Edwin Diaz had the year that he had this year with the Mets.
Literally
with
just
Seattle.
like shuddered. Like, I think I just got
And then
goosebumps.
all of a sudden, Zunino has 1 year left and is more expensive in arbitration. A non-tender candidate. You can't trade that guy. James Paxton has 1 year left instead of 2. You can't get rid of the rest of Cano's contract.
Diaz shows some vulnerabilities.
And if you don't decide to do that, you're probably re-signing Nelson Cruz, or you're doing something to replace him, and you're spending free agent dollars elsewhere so you can add to that team, because if you're keeping that team together, you're trying to add to it, right? Yeah. So now at the end of 2019, no matter what the end result was, you're screwed.
And now we're talking about a new GM and a new regime.
And you're talking about a 6-7 year rebuild like the Astros did. Yeah. The whole key to this rebuild being relatively short and being basically half as long as the Astros style rebuild is the timing of it all.
Yep.
That is the absolute key. And you said it right from the top. There was a little luck there because we didn't know Edwin Diaz was going to be that great.
We're going to talk about some of the other lucky things that happened after that. But I mean, I touched on it there, but if they don't do what they did when they did it, Jerry Dipoto is not the GM now, and Scott Servais isn't the manager now, are they?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think and at the time, Dan, like the biggest thing that stuck out to me about it was the timing of it from the start. We didn't know they were going to do that. They get to the end of that 2018 season, and all of a sudden, just a couple of weeks later, they start wheeling and dealing, and like, here we go. Like, I didn't see this coming necessarily, because even the new ownership, there was no indication they were just going to be okay with some kind of a rebuild. But Jerry Dipoto was hired with the understanding that he was going to be able to present, hey, here's what I think we should do. And they were going to be open to it. And they did, and they trusted him. And here we are. But the timing of it, like we were talking about in that clip, if you wait a year or even get into the middle of the next season and Diaz isn't performing anywhere near what he was, Paxton's hurt, Zunino's hurt, which happened a lot, or Zunino's not performing, which also happened a lot. Like they picked the perfect time to go do that. And they found, trade partners that were going to give them some value in order to do that. I don't even think like the Cano part of this was just a bonus. Being able to go out and maximize the return of Edwin Diaz to go get something. And we look back at that Paxton deal, Dan, the biggest return in that was Eric Swanson, who's a huge part of the bullpen. Like, they didn't really even get a whole lot out of Justice Sheffield and Dom Thompson-Williams. May not even be in baseball, at the start of next year. Right. So, obviously the Zunino deal, you get mixed, returns on that as well. But you go out and you decide you're going to do this, and you tell your ownership, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it. And then you start to execute. The timing's at the top of the list, because you wait a year, you're not getting half as much for Edwin Diaz. The Mets after year one took calls on Edwin Diaz.
Yeah.
After year one in it, because they didn't know they didn't know what they were going to be doing and where they were going, or, that they had the old GM, the agent GM, and they just didn't really know what direction they should be going. And so they at least took calls. Let's take calls that, are we messing something up here? Are we missing out on some value that we really, really need, more than we need a dominant bullpen guy? Now, obviously Diaz was great in 2022, but that just goes to show, like, and they didn't trade him because there was no indication they were going to get much for him. And that's the whole point. Seattle waits. That's the risk. Jerry Dipoto had a plan coming into this. I think he knew when he was hired that after 2018 was going to be it, or at least most likely going to be it, depending on how well they played. If they weren't in it in 2018, I think it would have started in July instead of waiting until the end of the year. But they were in it, so they added a little bit in May. That was when they made the Denard Span, Alex Colomé deal in late May that year, and they just kind of rode it out, and they were in it until the Oakland A's went all Darth Vader on everybody, and then it went in 97 games and leaving Seattle in the dust by 8 games. The time planning, I guess this really comes down, Dan, to Jerry Dipoto had a plan, and he stuck with it, and he's executed it. That's really what it comes down to. Like, I keep using the word timing, but it's really, hey, have a plan. And they did, and we're seeing the results of that right now.
You talked about that in that show too. You talked about the plan, and you talked specifically in terms of how it affected their draft the year before, in that they took George Kirby in that draft when maybe he wasn't the consensus pick among that front office. But he made the most sense because of what they were hunting, what they were looking for, and what they knew their development strengths were at the time as well. At the time, I'm going to play another piece of sound too, because you talked about, okay, now that we know the process is underway, now that we know this is happening, and there may still be more pieces to come, what has to happen next? You asked me that question. This is what we talked about.
The interesting thing to me from here on out is, because we know what they need to do. They need to stay patient with a lot of it. They need to, there's probably it's probably 33% stay patient, 33% look for opportunities, and 33% somewhere in between. Like, okay, we have this small opportunity, let's go do this. We have this small opportunity, let's go do this. But do you see, what do you see as the biggest obstacles between now and the Mariners becoming a viable division contender, like a 95 win team? Obviously it's going to take some time, but is there a position group? Is there a development issue? Is there does the field staff concern you? Is there something that stands out more than everything else when it comes to this is what's between the Mariners today and winning something?
To me, I think it's all about the starting rotation. I mean, you see what we just saw in the playoffs this year, right? And I think one of the best postseasons we've seen in quite a long time.
I loved it.
And especially when you look at those last 4 squads, but even the wild card teams. I mean, you've got to have 3 studs minimum, and really you need, you probably need 7 or 8 guys to get through a regular season with. But when you get down to a postseason roster, you got to have 3 studs and a 4th guy that can go if you need him to.
You need your Anibal Sanchez, right?
Yeah,
you need that guy because you're going to need
him
him once or twice to start games, and then
100%.
maybe out of the bullpen.
Okay, one more piece that piggybacks off of that, because we kind of took that thought and ran with it a little bit more, and then it's going to bring us right back to where we are today. And so if you kind of fast forward to 2 years from now, when we think the Mariners are going to start looking really interesting, and let's just project, let's say, Sheffield, Gilbert, and Kirby,
sure,
or Dunn, take your pick, are ready to throw 160 to 180 innings or whatever. That's cool and that's exciting, and we haven't had that in a very long time, and I look forward to that. But are those 3 guys going to be capable of getting to the point of what we just saw in the postseason?
If you look at the ceilings of all,
everything would have to go right. Everything, those guys
maybe, and then some.
Yeah, and that's the A's to get to the next level. Even with those 3 guys, and this is the point I guess I'm trying to make, is they may still have to acquire someone to add to that mix that can kind of lead that group
to finally get over the hump. And
that feels like at some point that's going to happen. That was a concept we talked about a lot that night, and I think in another show that we did a couple months later about the early signs, even on that day, were that Jerry Dipoto might be good at this rebuild thing, but is he a good GM? You would make that point a lot. I've heard you say it a lot. I'm not, up until even last year, I'm not sure that he's a good GM yet, because those moves were going to have to be made. And coming into this season, they still hadn't been made, although they bring Robbie Ray in. They convince a free agent to take our money and add to the rotation. But it's funny to look back on that and think that, Sheffield and Dunn were supposed to be part of that. But I think it's another solid point to make too, that not everything has worked perfectly since then, but they've done other things to fill those in. And then the big move for Castillo this year obviously put him over the hump.
Yeah, it's almost, Dan, like they had a plan. Like, hey, what if Sheffield or Dunn or both aren't part of this at all? Even in the bullpen, what are we going to do? Well, how about Robbie Ray and Luis Castillo to add to George Kirby, Marco Gonzalez, and Logan Gilbert? So it all starts with having a plan and then saying, hey, what are the ways we're going to get here?
Yeah.
Well, we can do this. Like all the guys can just develop and we could just have like Dunn and Sheffield and Eric Swanson, even after that trade, like they can all that can just be our rotation. But when those things start to, what's the term I'm looking for? Not work out, I guess, when they start to fail a little bit, and when you have to move Swanson to the bullpen and Sheffield doesn't develop and Justin Dunn has injury issues and he doesn't really develop either, and you end up trading Justin Dunn anyway. Like what are the backup plans here? Well, what do you need to do? And even if, Dan, Sheffield works out, like he's a 4. If Dunn works out, he's a 5. You're still making the Robbie Ray and then Luis Castillo deals, because like we were talking about in that first clip, you get into the postseason and you need to be able to throw like 3 or 4 power guys, at the other team. And you really need that to be elite in your division over the course of a regular season anyway. The biggest difference between the Astros when they won the World Series and went to the World Series, the year after they went to the World Series, the biggest difference maker at that point for them became the combination of Justin Verlander and Garrett Cole at the top of that rotation. They would always get at least 1 win at the start of a series because it was Verlander and Garrett Cole, or Garrett Cole and Justin Verlander, and sometimes 2. That was the biggest difference maker. They're doing it differently now. They did it differently the year before. But Seattle kind of has a similar thing developing, even if Gilbert, Kirby, Castillo, Ray, even if none of them are actually as good as Garrett Cole or Justin Verlander, at some point that you guarantee yourself a win or 2, essentially, by loading up on guys and expecting them to go out and perform exactly the way they're capable of doing it. And that's kind of the way I'm thinking about the Astros series with the Mariners. Like, you get Gilbert, you get Castillo, like one of those guys is probably going to pitch really well, and you're probably going to have a really good chance to win one of those games in Houston. Again, I go back to the whole idea. They had a plan and they started executing it and it started working. So that's why, Dan, I haven't really been asking that question or saying that about Jerry Dipoto the last 6 months or a year, because I actually think Jerry Dipoto is pretty good at this. I'm not saying he's a great GM, but I think it's pretty clear he's a good GM now that we're seeing him execute free agent signings, putting a big league roster together, a roster that can win 90 plus games. And I'm really excited to see what he can do over the offseason, because that's really going to make the difference between wild card Seattle Mariners and a team that can win 100 games and be a World Series contender. And that's obviously going to be a goal come this offseason.
Yeah, it's certainly the exciting part. This doesn't, as fun as this is, this doesn't feel like a finished product. And I think when you talk about having a game plan, part of that, whether you're applying it to a big global plan like a rebuild or even an in-game game plan, is you have to be able to adapt, right? You have to be able to dodge some punches. You have to be able to change on the fly.
Yeah, some things aren't going to work out. You look at the Braves.
And we've talked about the pitching. Mm-hmm. We haven't talked about the lineup. And 4 years ago when we sat in that room, we thought that the future was going to be Jared Kelenic, Evan White, and Kyle Lewis. And 2 of those 3 aren't even on the roster, haven't contributed at all. Jared Kelenick's only on the roster because of injury issues and isn't doing much. So they had to pivot. They had to change some things because those guys aren't part of what's happening right now, some of those decisions. And what we didn't know that day is that Jerry Dipoto had AJ Preller's phone number tucked away, ready to use. And about a year and a half later, made the trade with San Diego. And really that was, I think we talked about it on some other shows we did together. That was kind of when we started to see, oh, hey, wait a minute. That's something we didn't see coming. That's frosting on the cake. Something cool might be happening here. I mean, look what that trade brought us.
Yeah, I think anytime you make a deal, I mean, they gave up Austin Nola. I'm not saying that's not giving up anything, but you give up Austin Nola in that deal, a guy you got for nothing. They signed Austin Nola for free. Like, he was free. And like a little over a year later, they trade him for what turns out to be Ty France and Andres Munoz. We'll leave the Trammell and Luis Torrens thing out of it for now, even though those guys have brought at least a little bit of value so far. Munoz in France, where would the Mariners be right now without Andres Munoz and Ty France? Well, they probably don't even get to the postseason. But even if they do, they don't win that Toronto series.
Yeah.
like that's a trade that really set this team up. And it was a little bit of a different deal than the previous deals. You make the deal with the Mets, you make the deal with the Phillies, you make the deal with, like, you're moving money around, like with Segura to Philly. The Mets deal, yeah, you move money, but you also got young talent in return. The Paxton deal was about bringing in young talent. And while they did get young talent, it was more about young talent that was ready to go. Ty France did not report to AAA Tacoma. He was a big leaguer from right then moving forward. So now we got a glimpse of, hey, what is Jerry Dipoto in that group over there, Justin Hollander in that front office and those analysts, like, what else are they good at? And that was really the first time we got an opportunity to go, can they acquire big league talent? Because it's easy to go, let's acquire some prospects we like, because you're just looking at tools. It's almost like drafting again. Let's go get this 19-year-old Jared Kelenic because we really liked him last year in the draft. I mean, that's relatively easy to do. It's not easy to find the Ty Francis of the world, the Andres Munoz of the world. And Munoz, while he threw hard, didn't have this kind of a slider. They saw this in him with spin rate and release, and you have the wrist action. Like, their scouting and their analysts put that together and put the big value on Munoz. So that was kind of the first move that told me, hey, these guys aren't just rebuilders. Like, this is a deal that suggests they actually know what they're doing. They're looking forward, and again, sticking to the plan. And that was just kind of the next step. And that was the August trade in 2020, the shortened season, when the deadline was pushed back to the end of August. But didn't really know a ton about Ty France at that point, but he's always been the key to that trade.
What I thought was different about that trade and kind of signaled that things were maybe not going to be the same as they've always been is, God, for so long, Mariner trades were always made out of desperation on our part. We had a glaring hole, a glaring weakness, and we announced to the world. I thought Jack Zarincek was especially terrible at this. I always felt
Austin Jackson. Yeah.
Always felt like the way that he went about trades is he just kind of read the paper every day. Oh, so-and-so's available. Well, I'm going to call and see what I can do to get him. And teams knew that we were desperate and knew we would overpay. This was a 180-degree turnaround. This was AJ Preller really wanting Austin Nolan, thinking he was a piece that was missing from their roster.
This was San Diego being kind of desperate. They needed catcher production really badly.
And Jerry Dipoto smelled the blood in the water, and he sensed it, and he kept, when you read about the genesis of that trade and how it came together, he just kind of kept trying to add to it. And hey, why don't you throw in this reliever that's injured too? Because, again, and that to me was a turning point. That, hey, we have a guy that's a legit deal maker in our front office. And then we saw that again this spring. They try to get some of the big bats, right? They went after Chris Bryant. They took a shot at Trevor Story. We all know that. Fans were so frustrated that we didn't do enough, that we somehow failed because we weren't able to get those guys to come here. So he pivots and he makes what at the time was called the Jesse Winker trade. Right. Guy with a 5-year track record, outstanding hitter, one of the best left-handed hitters in the National League, coming off an all-star year. As it turns out, the throw-in in that deal that we took on because of salary considerations was Eugenio Suarez. And I'm not sure that we're sitting here today without him, and not just because of the 30 home runs, but the influence that guy has had in the clubhouse. And I don't want to minimize Winker's influence either. I mean, for all of his struggles at the plate, he was a huge part of the culture of that clubhouse too. But that trade, which at the time fans looked at as a failure, looked at as a fallback. And some fans still thought, well, if we had just kept Kyle Seager, we wouldn't need to go get a third baseman. Just another sign of Jerry being really creative and going out and getting a couple of guys we didn't even know were available.
And being specifically proactive as well. You obviously, Seager, you were going to decline that option. That happened. It was obvious Seager wasn't going to be back. This was before he had announced his retirement. We already knew at that point, like that deal had been made, but we already knew that the club was moving on. And to go out and fill what we thought at the time was a big need in your lineup in Winker, and get a guy who's going to be able to handle third base for you in the same deal. Yeah. And essentially, Dan, you just swap those two players. If you got a win and a half out of Suarez, and Winker was like a 4+ win guy, I mean, that's essentially what happened. Just flip those two guys around. You got 6 wins out of that deal, pretty remarkable. But one of the things I've been talking about quite a bit is who knew Eugenio Suarez had the value, that the inquantifiable value of being a great teammate and being a positive influence and maybe a leader when it comes to that clubhouse and the team culture, because that's not something you can see on the back of a baseball card. That's not even really something that scouts are going to tell you from sitting on the Reds for 2 weeks at the end of the 2021 season. That's something that former teammates can tell you, people that managed him in the minors, people that played with him in the minors, people that worked in the front office of the Reds. That's the thing that not everybody just said. That's not something Jerry Dipoto can go, all right, well, Suarez can do this, this, and this. And oh, by the way, I see here he's really good in the. You have to ask those questions and do that work. Who knew? Like that's from a fan standpoint, from an observer. I had no idea Suarez was this fun, was this positive, and yet every single day went out there and bust his butt and gave everything he had all at the same time. The fact that he hit 230 with 30 home runs and an above league average on base percentage, great. That's what you need from him. But to do it the way that he did it, that's something I never saw coming. It's just something that it kind of goes to show. You see these trades on the surface, they're not necessarily going to turn out that way. We know what the goal was in that deal. We know what Seattle thought. We thought they thought Winker was a 4-win bat. Yep. And they thought Suarez was a 1 to 2 win guy that was essentially just an extension of Kyle Seager for another couple of years at basically half the salary. Well, it turns out Suarez is like a core guy. I mean, it's remarkable to see how trades like that work out. We were just talking about the Paxton deal where Swanson is going to end up, if Swanson gets through next year and has another solid 1.5 win season, he's going to end up giving the Mariners more wins above replacement than Paxton gave the Yankees, despite the fact that Swanson's giving all of that value out of the bullpen. It's just remarkable. It's weird and strange and awesome at the same time how sometimes trades work out like this, not necessarily as planned, but there are all kinds of ways these players can bring value. And Suarez is a fun story. Somebody should write a book about that.
Well, and you talk about, you've mentioned the word plan a bunch of times, and I think the word vision can be used too. I think Jerry Dipoto's had a vision on how he wanted to build this thing, and I don't think you can understate clubhouse culture in this either. And especially when you consider that when we sat and talked 4 years ago, the Dr. Lorena Martin thing had just happened, and then we had to go through the Kevin Mather thing last year. And in both those instances, there were large segments of the fan base that were like, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Get rid of everybody. It's broken. It's a terrible culture. It's divisive. It's toxic. Let's start over. That clearly isn't the case, because now, I mean, what are we seeing now in the post-game interviews, right? We saw it on Saturday from Scott Servais. What did he talk about when he was asked, how did this team do this? He didn't talk about quality at bats. He didn't talk about his pitching staff. He talked about the family atmosphere and the culture in that clubhouse, and guys love each other and they love playing for each other. And then we saw it. So now we go to this year's trade deadline. And that moment that we talked about 4 years ago that was going to have to happen at some point, you're going to have to go out and get that guy to get you over the hump. And Luis Castillo was the number one pitcher available on the trade market this offseason. All the big teams were after him. The New York Yankees, all of them. For good reason. And we gave up a massive package to give him. Two of our top 5 prospects, 2 potential big-time big leaguers at shortstop, plus a couple other players. And you bring him in, and he provides everything that you expect him to on the mound. But then because of that culture, and we haven't even mentioned Julio Rodriguez's name yet, and what he's done on the field, but also what he's done in that clubhouse. And the day he signs his big extension with the team locks him up, presumably for the rest of his career. Luis Castillo calls his agent and says, this is where I want to be. I don't want to go to free agency. I want you to get a hold of the front office. I want to stay here and sign long-term, which certainly makes the package you gave up for him a lot more palpable, for sure, especially after you see how he pitched in game 1 of the wild card series. But it just kind of brings it all full circle and just speaks to your point that, like, this wasn't just throwing darts at a dartboard throughout the process and hoping certain things stick and things work and we'll just figure it out as we go along. This is a plan coming together.
Yeah, think about how much has changed over the last couple of years. When Jerry Dipoto showed up in Seattle, the word I was getting from the people I know in baseball was first off, it started off as Jerry Dipoto quit on the Angels. Why would you want that guy? Because they didn't know what actually happened. Then it started to leak out in 2018, 2019, what really actually happened with the Angels. So they let that go. Then it was Jerry Dipoto's a dictator, doesn't want anybody else's help, wants to do everything himself so he can get all the credit. And then all of a sudden we start learning about like, hey, they made the JP Crawford deal based pretty much solely at the end of the day on an analyst or two coming up with some guys that they really, really liked. So they went after him. Like, does that sound like a dictatorship to you? Of course it doesn't. So that's kind of a strange, kind of a thing to think back on, that was and now it's, oh yeah, I just don't think they can put them over the top. So then if they go out and win a World Series, it's going to be, yeah, but they can't win too. It's like, yeah, at this point,
that's a good
shut
thought.
up, Chuck. Just come on, man. Like go away. So like, I feel like Jerry, like a player, has been like answering questions. Like you see a player like Jared needs to do this, or Julio needs to, okay, there you go. It's just like a quarterback in the NFL. Like, all right, first year, can he do this? Can he do this? All right, can he do this? All right, he's a complete quarterback. Really believe in him. You can win a Super Bowl. That's been Jerry Dipoto the entire time that he's been in Seattle, Dan. It's crazy. And he continues to answer question after question after question.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. I think people just assume, a lot of fans assume, they'll look at players that way. Gosh, he needs to get a little better. He needs to develop. That quarterback needs to get better at this or that, or pitcher needs to add another pitch. But they just assume that managers and GMs are finished products. What they do, their track record is who they are. They'll never change. Things will never get better. If they have one bad draft, they're bad drafters and they're always going to draft bad. Or if they make one free agent signing that doesn't work out, you can't trust them to sign free agents. It's an interesting analogy, and let's apply
same
that
with Scott
now.
Servais, Dan. Think about Servais. Is that where we're going to go? Yeah, it's Servais. The same thing.
Because a couple of years ago, I think we had this conversation that we weren't sure if he was the long-term guy, that he had a player development background and had never been a field manager before Dipoto brought him up here, and maybe he was the right guy at the right time with a young roster, but that at some point they would hand it off to a younger guy, maybe a Chris Negron, somebody like that, and he would kick back upstairs and sit in the office with Jerry. But man, if there's one thing that's impressed me the most this year, is I absolutely love hearing that guy talk about his players. I love hearing, you can nitpick in-game decisions and things like that. You can do that with any manager. But have the questions about Scott Servais been answered?
Yeah, absolutely. I think heading into the 2019 season, I still would have bet by 2022 Servais would not be the field manager. But once we got past 2019, you saw that rebuild season and how he handled that. I started to become convinced that, okay, he's going to hang around at least another year. And then you get into 2020 and actually played a little better despite all the circumstances than most expected. And I'm like, he's going to get a shot. Like Servais is going to get a shot as the field manager with the next team that's capable of going to the postseason. And in 21 and 22, like the way that Scott Servais and that group go about making decisions, using some of the data, but also just in terms of how they plan it out, the players know what's going on, the entire staff knows what's going on. Like, this is a guy who really wants to manage. Like, he's not there just to guide the rebuild to the next guy. That's not what it was clear that's not what he was there for. Yeah. And it's obviously working at this point. It's been 7 years and they're finally in the postseason, but I don't look at this as hey, Scott Servais is probably still a short-termer. I think he manages this team for the next 3 or 4 years at this point. And I would be shocked if we didn't hear about more extensions for Scott Servais, that staff, even for Jerry Dipoto. Now that Jerry Dipoto is president of baseball operations, Justin Hollander's been promoted to general manager. But Scott Servais too. And when you look at the decisions that Scott Servais that they have made with that field staff, like Scott Servais is creating a place that people want to be, not just players but coaches. And you talked about Luis Castillo. Luis Castillo's agent went to the Mariners and said, I want to be here. Yeah. So think about what has changed since, let's say August of 2021, August of last season. Okay. So at that point, like, let's say August 1st, if you're a future free agent looking at the Seattle Mariners, Dan, you're like, all right, this team hasn't won in 2 decades. they're okay right now. Like they're a little upstart team. Maybe they win 85, 88 games. Like they're playing pretty good baseball right now. But what's their future look like? They don't have a bunch of young studs. They got some guys starting to come up and do some things. I don't know that I'm ever going to consider the Seattle Mariners. The travel and stuff is something that can't do anything about, but they haven't won. We haven't seen them commit. We haven't seen the ownership commit. They don't have young stars. Like this is not really a team that since then they go out and they sign Robbie Ray.
Yep.
They get Julio come up who breaks through, performs, and then they extend him essentially to a lifetime contract. They trade for and then extend Luis Castillo, and they win and get into the postseason. And it looks like a place free agents are going to want to go. Who the hell isn't going to want to play with Julio Rodriguez, man? Like, who doesn't want to play with Eugenio Suarez? Who doesn't want to play with Luis Castillo and the Logan Gilberts of the world and for Scott Servais? The Seattle Mariners are more of a destination in Major League Baseball than they've ever been. Even versus the 95 teams with Lou or even 2000, 2001 with Ichiro. And this is a team players are going to flock to more than they ever have before. I'm not saying they're going to prefer Seattle over the Dodgers or the Yankees or the Red Sox, but the Mariners, there aren't any of those excuses anymore. If the market says this player is worth $175 million, Seattle is going to pay $175 million. They're not going to have to pay $230 to get him to show up, put on the uniform, and play for the Mariners. And that starts, to be honest with you, that starts with John Stanton trusting Jerry Dipoto to build what we're watching right now.
It's interesting that you mentioned August 1st of last year, because I was just thinking as part of the Scott Servais discussion and the cultures that he's built and how good he is at communicating with his players and keeping them focused. You know what had happened right before August 1st of last year was a Kendall Graven trade. Mm-hmm. And trade him at the deadline during the Houston series, and they're playing him at home. He's your best reliever. You trade him for Abraham Toro. And it wasn't well received in the clubhouse. There were accusations that Dipoto didn't communicate with him, that he didn't come down and talk to him, that it was a stab in the back. We kind of know now that there were a small faction of players, one in particular who's not with the organization anymore, that kind of drove that whole narrative. But for him to keep them on track even after that and keep them together, and which led to the run at the end of the year, I don't want to get too much into next offseason. We'll have to have that discussion again, but it felt like we were almost there last offseason. Trevor Story listened. Chris Bryant listened. Marcus Semien listened. They entertained meetings. You know, you wonder if a couple of those guys maybe have some regrets right now. The travel's always been something we hear about, but you feel like that can be overcome and mitigated if it's just a great place to play and a chance to win.
It's really no different than, where do you work and what is it like? Do you hate it because the boss is always looking over your shoulder and, the culture there that is built isn't conducive to you being able to make mistakes and then get better? I mean, it's the same with a baseball team. It's the same, man. You have to feel comfortable going to work every day and trying to get better and do the right thing to do your job, because you all have the same goal. Like if you work for Google, you all have the same goal. Ultimately, you're a player for the Seattle Mariners, you have the same goal. So can we have an environment where when I make a mistake, I don't get screamed at, or another player doesn't come down on me, where that player, Suarez or Haniger, puts his arm around me and says, you took that turn really wide at second base. Like, were you just thinking you were going to third instead of what the hell are you doing, man? Like the whole Michael Jordan stuff. Like that doesn't work in Major League Baseball. We know it doesn't work in Major League Baseball, especially the last 30 years or so. We've heard about some of those 80s Oakland A's teams, 88, 89, 90, where they only won one World Series. They probably should have won 3 or 4. They didn't like each other, and they didn't play well together. And they won despite the bad culture. That doesn't work anymore in Major League Baseball. You have to have that. And Scott Servais and Jerry Dipoto and the leaders down there, the Mitch Hanigers, the Marco Gonzalez of the world, J.P. Crawford, Eugenio Suarez now, absolutely huge. And they make that scenario down there. They make that baseball team. And when, again, we'll talk about the winter later. There are other things to do. When that time comes in a month, players are going to be like, hey, how about Seattle? Players are going to bring that up. Like, again, you mentioned that Luis Castillo's agent went to the Mariners. That is absolute fact. The agent for Luis Castillo went to the Mariners and said, we'd like to talk about an extension. Usually, I would say 95% of the time, when a veteran like that is on a team like the Mariners, the team goes to him and says, we'd really like you to stay. Like long-term, can we start talking about it? And then maybe you start talking about it. When the agent comes to, I mean, that says a ton about the environment, about the team, about the direction of the team, and about how other players are obviously going to think about this baseball team as well. That might be the most exciting thing that's happening right now in Mariners land.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what's happening now, right? Let's come full circle. 12:37 first pitch on Tuesday in Houston. Logan Gilbert against still TBD. Interesting news out of Houston today. There's some sickness issues. Dusty Baker refuses to commit to who his rotation is. Maybe some of that's gamesmanship. Who knows? But Logan Gilbert set to start game one down there. If the Mariners and Astros play 10 best of 5 series, how many do the Mariners win?
Whew, that's a good question. 3 or 4. If you make that best of 7 series, maybe just 1 or 2. Like when the longer the series, the more impact and depth take over. But Seattle has a shot in this series because it's only 5 games, and because they're going to get to throw Logan Gilbert and Luis Castillo right now, their 2 best starters, and have the opportunity to use George Kirby. I think that's going to be a key decision in this series. What do the Mariners do in game 3?
Yeah.
Right. Robbie Ray's not throwing the ball well right now. The Astros have hit him really hard the last couple times he's faced them. He does not present the best opportunity for the Mariners to win a game right now by starting. And this might be the last team you'd want to start him against. So even though that game would be at home, you're going to have a chance to go Gilbert, Castillo, Kirby. I feel good about the Mariners winning at least one of those games and pushing this to 4.
Yeah.
But if you win one of those first 2 games, Dan, I mean, this series might go 5. And that's what's great about the 5-game series. Either one of these teams could win. I have the Astros winning in 4. Would not surprise me if it took 5. Would not surprise me really all that much if Seattle won in 5. You look back to the beginning of the year. The Astros and the Mariners split their first 12 games. And think about what was going on with the Mariners at the time. No Mitch Haniger. He only played in 1 game against Houston early in the year before he got hurt. Julio Rodriguez didn't hit the first month of the season. That includes 1 entire Astros series. And then he missed, some games in another series. Ty France has been banged up. Carlos Santana wasn't on the team. Like the Mariners, the Astros are different too. Right. But the Mariners were different the majority of the time they played the Astros. So you add, I mean, even just the Mitch Haniger factor, you add Mitch Haniger to that lineup with a healthy France, a healthy Suarez, and a healthy Julio. It's a completely different lineup that the Astros haven't faced all year this year. So I give them more than just a puncher's chance. I think the key is winning one of those first 2 games. You win one of those first 2 games, and it's more 55-45, 50-50 than anything else, which is fun. And so if in generally speaking, if that's the kind of the way you're looking at this series, I mean, they're going to be nail biters probably. Stay in the game. Keep the game close. Don't make a bunch of mistakes. Take it pitch by pitch, game by game. And Seattle's got a shot. It's I didn't think that I would buy that if you asked me that 3 weeks ago, Dan. But I think the makeup of both clubs right now and the way some guys are starting to perform, Adam Frazier, we're seeing a little more from Adam Frazier. We're seeing even some of the bench guys, even the Toros of the world, started to hit a little late in the season, giving you at least some confidence they'd be able to give you a good at bat if called upon in the series. And Carlos Santana right now swinging the bat as well as he is. Cal Raleigh swinging the bat as well as he is. And the fact that we know at some level in this series, because it's going to go at least 3, Julio's going to hit and Mitch Haniger is going to hit. Yep. That gives me confidence they can score 4, maybe 5 runs, and win a game. If you score 5 runs even against the Astros, you should win that game. And I think Seattle's capable of doing it.
It's going to be fun. I think in baseball more than any other sport, sometimes certain teams just have something going on and you can't quantify it and it doesn't make sense, but it's hard to put your finger on. But this team just feels like a team that believes they can do anything at any time against anyone. And Saturday was certainly the latest example of that. And coming off of that into game 1, they got to be flying high. I thought the most important thing that I saw in game 1 wasn't just that Luis Castillo went out and dominated that lineup. It was that the entire team just seemed like the moment wasn't too big for them. They weren't overwhelmed at all.
It's one of the cleanest games they played all year,
really
too, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey, this was fun. It was fun to look back and look ahead a little bit. And like I said, I guess I don't know. I don't like to pat myself on the back too much, but I guess we're not dumb.
Yeah, Dan, I think the important thing at the time that we were talking about that is we weren't trying to get cute with it. It was like, what have the Mariners presented with us? There were some obvious answers with some obvious things, and there were some here are the sensible things to think about what they're probably trying to do, what they're definitely trying to do, what they could try to do. And we just took it like that. And that's, to be honest with you, that's baseball things. That's pretty much what I do twice a week, every week on the show, is just go, what's logical here? And what's completely illogical, I throw out the window or I make fun of it. I mean, that's just kind of what I do. You ask an illogical question, I'm going to make fun of you.
And there's a lot of fans out there right now that didn't believe in the rebuild, didn't want it, weren't supportive of it. But you know what? None of that matters now. All that matters is that this baseball team is fun to watch. They're in the playoffs. They've won a playoff series. And not just that, but if we do another show in 4 years, it'll be interesting again to see and look back on this 4 years, because I think the thing we haven't even touched on yet today, because do either of us believe the rebuild's done yet? Right? This roster is not complete. The best years are ahead. And I think this is just the beginning of a very, very long window potentially of contention for this.
Yeah, this is like you're building a house and you still have a few things in the house. Like, what's the man cave going to look like? Like, you're still building the man cave and you're still like, am I getting the 123-inch TV or am I getting the 147-inch TV? Like, you're still deciding on that. And you haven't built the fence around it or even painted the fence. So you still got some things to do. You still got some things to tinker with, some significant, some not so significant. And it's probably going to be like this the rest of the time. You're going to tinker every single year. You're going to see the Braves do that. You see the Dodgers do that. And sometimes that involves big time impact players, the Freddie Freemans and the Matt Olsons of the world. They change teams sometimes. And that's what Seattle's going to be looking to do this winter.
Well, I think that's a good way to end it too, because I don't think either you or I are trying to say, I hope nobody thinks we're trying to say that we think this is a finished product. It's not. We're just getting started. And I think you touched on this, but next year, 2023 isn't about the wild card. It's about going after the Astros. It's about trying to win a division, making those moves in the offseason to put them in a position to do that. And maybe we'll get a little bit of a glimpse of that. Maybe we can send a message over the next 7 or 8 days in this 5-game series, which begins tomorrow. It was a pleasure as always having you on, Jason. Jason Churchill at Prospect Insider on Twitter. He's a great follow. Give it to him there. And also, if you haven't heard Baseball Things, the podcast, look it up on any podcast platform. You can also subscribe on Patreon, get some really cool extra things as well. Jason, it was a pleasure having you on. Enjoy the next few days, would you?
Anytime. Let's do it again in 4 years, but we should do it before then as well.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks for listening, you guys. I am Dan Viennes. That's Jason. We'll talk to you soon. Go Mariners. Cool, man.
Yeah, fun stuff as always. So anytime you want to brush off the old podcast, I'm around. Couple things that I'm not really willing to go public with yet, but I'll share them with